When you think of the Black Death, you probably picture corpses, mass graves, burning cities, a continent on its knees begging God for an explanation that never came. And in a way, it was the end of the world. But here's what the history books skip over. For the people who survived it, the Black Death wasn't just a catastrophe. It was the most accidental revolution in human history. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed a system. And the world that crawled out the other side looked nothing like the one that went in. Somewhere in Europe, the year is 1347. A ship pulls into the harbour at Messina, Sicily. The sailors on deck are not waving. Most of them are already dead. The ones still alive are covered in swellings the size of eggs, clustered in the armpits, the groin, the throat, weeping blood and pus through cracked skin. Port officials ordered the fleet out immediately. It was already too late. What came off those ships would go on to kill roughly 1 in 3 people on the European continent. Some estimates put it closer to 1 in 2. The Black Death had arrived, and Europe had no idea what was coming. To understand how it got there, you have to go back further. A bacterium called Yersinia pestis had been quietly circulating in wild rodent populations across the Asian steppe for centuries. Then, in the early 1300s, it mutated. It became dramatically more lethal, and it found a vehicle. The Mongol Golden Horde was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa on the coast of Crimea in 1346. The plague began tearing through the Mongol army. Soldiers were dying faster than they could fight. So the commanding Khan did something almost never done before in the history of warfare. He loaded the corpses of his dead soldiers into catapults and flung them over the city walls. When the people of Kaffa finally fled by ship, they carried Yersinia pestis into every port they touched. That's not a metaphor. That's how it started. A catapult full of dead bodies changed the trajectory of Western civilization. The bacterium moved in 3 forms, and each one was its own horror. Bubonic plague hit the lymph nodes first. Fever, delirium, internal bleeding that turned the skin black beneath the surface. Within 3 to 5 days, 80% of untreated victims were dead. Pneumonic plague settled in the lungs. No fleas required, just breath, just standing close to someone you loved. And then there was septicemic plague. It hit the blood directly. You were usually dead before the buboes even had time to form. Medieval doctors had no framework for any of it. They blamed bad air. They blamed the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn. They were doing their best with a universe that had suddenly stopped making sense. By 1348, the disease had consumed Constantinople and was racing along the trade roads. Florence, Rome, Paris, London. And here's the brutal irony. The very infrastructure that made the medieval economy function became the delivery system for its near destruction. Florence lost more than half its population. Construction projects were abandoned mid-build. Great painters died before finishing their life's work, and the traditions they had built simply stopped because there was no one left who had learned from them. The historian Giovanni Boccaccio watched it happen in real time. Neighbors abandoning neighbors. Parents refusing to visit dying children. He wasn't judging them. He was just describing what happens when a society hits a wall it has no tools to climb. And then came the blame, because there's always blame. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells, of engineering the plague deliberately. The accusations spread faster than any investigation could challenge them. In Strasbourg, several hundred Jewish people were burned alive in a cemetery in February of 1349, months before the plague had even reached the city. Pope Clement VI issued formal orders stating that Jewish people were not responsible. It changed almost nothing. When people are terrified and have no explanation, they don't wait for the truth. They find a target. The church took catastrophic losses. Clergy were among the most exposed because tending the sick was a religious duty. Monasteries lost entire communities in weeks. And when the surviving priests could not explain why God had allowed this, people started finding their own explanations. Flagellant movements spread across Europe. Groups publicly whipping themselves through town squares, believing visible suffering might satisfy divine wrath. Think about that for a second. the most powerful institution in the Western world, had watched a third of its continent die, and its best answer wasn't enough. You can draw a straight line from the mass graves of 1349 to Martin Luther nailing his theses to a door in 1517. But here's where the story turns. After the dying stopped, something nobody had planned for began to happen. Labour was suddenly the scarcest resource on earth. Landlords who had spent generations extracting work from serfs found themselves with empty fields and nobody to farm them. And the peasants who survived knew exactly what had changed. Wages rose. Serfs began demanding payment for labour that had previously been owed as obligation. Landlords who refused found their workers had simply walked to an estate that would pay them. For the first time in centuries, the person doing the work had leverage. The feudal system cracked under simple arithmetic. Too few people, too much work. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 was driven partly by attempts to claw back the gains survivors had won. The aristocracy fought hard. Some of it came back, but a great deal of it never did. Medicine changed too. Physicians who had watched ancient theories fail in real time started doing something radical. They started observing. The Black Death made it undeniable that disease travelled, that it spread between people, that it had a mechanism completely separate from astrological alignment or divine punishment. Quarantine was formalized as a public health tool in this exact period. Venice implemented a mandatory isolation period for incoming ships that eventually extended to 40 days. 40 giorni in Italian. That's where the word quarantine comes from. 40 days. Born directly out of the Black Death. So here's the question nobody asks. If the Black Death was purely a catastrophe, why did the Renaissance explode into existence directly on the other side of it? Why did art, philosophy, science, and individual rights all accelerate immediately after the worst demographic disaster in European history? Because the plague didn't just remove people. It removed the weight of a system that had been suffocating innovation for centuries. The concentrated wealth left behind by the dead funded the art. The crisis of faith funded the questioning. The labour shortage funded the dignity. We remember the Black Death as a story about death. And it was. 50 million people died. That number should never be minimised. But if we only tell the story of what was lost, we miss the story of what was built on top of it. The survivors didn't just endure. They negotiated. They revolted. They questioned. They cracked the systems the modern world is still living inside of today. We built monuments to the dead. We forgot to credit them for the world they accidentally left behind. The Black Death was not the end of the story. It was the most violent, most painful, most unplanned chapter break in Western history. And everything you think of as the modern world began on the next page.